The media's depiction of supervillains has always provided audiences with a suave yet sinister portrayal of evil. From Dracula to Bond antagonists, this stereotype is so prevalent that it even resulted in Prada collaborating with some of the actors famous for these sorts of roles for a villain-themed runway collection back in 2012. Despite the machinations and malicious intent of these fictional characters, they still always retain an aura of coolness. Unfortunately, supervillains having effortless swag is just another Hollywood myth. The small group of people who are the closest thing we have to these fictional antagonists in real life seem to struggle with their fashion game, if anything. Well, there are some exceptions, but we'll get into that later on in the video. Tech Billionaires, once a proudly dorky bunch, have in recent times shed their Patagonia vest cocoons and emerged as tech oligarchs, who no longer have to utilize fashion to create a false image of humility, relatability, or trustworthiness. For the wider class of ultra-wealthy elites, there is a stereotype of an understated and quiet luxury approach to fashion being the norm. The television series Succession showed this off and even resulted in a large mainstream fashion trend which started a few years ago and has now completely run its course, with fast fashion brands such as Pretty Little Thing currently trying to pick at its corpse. But tech billionaires never really adhered to this old money uniform. Members of this newer breed of elites are far less subtle with their power plays, and their clothing choices follow suit, especially within recent times. As these figures are becoming increasingly more powerful and visible in recent years, and therefore more scrutinized by the public, I thought it would be a great idea to scrutinize their fits and look into how their fashion has been used to convey or conceal their beliefs and intentions over the years. With that being said, I think it's only right we start with the OG tech overlord, who is arguably the only one ever to have a meaningful and lasting impact on the fashion zeitgeist over the past few decades. Everyone knows the famous Harvey Dent quote, "You either die a hero or you live long enough to see yourself become the villain." Well, I think Steve Jobs definitely represents the former part of this statement. Despite being known for an autocratic leadership style, he had a positive and respected public image and was at least partly responsible for the innovative and genius mystique that Silicon Valley CEOs had for a while. You know, until more recently where his younger counterparts destroyed that image and revealed that being a ruthless businessman and utilizing gentrified corruption, also known as lobbying, was more important to that role than actually being an innovator. Saying that Steve Jobs was noteworthy in terms of fashion might be confusing to some people, as he was pretty much always wearing the same very basic outfit: a black turtleneck, jeans, and New Balances. This wasn't even just a preferred outfit, he was committed to this fit like a cartoon character. Even so, you're probably still thinking it's a very minimal and kind of boring outfit, so how has he had any meaningful impact on fashion? Well, that's kind of the point, but we'll get into that in a moment. But first, let's look into the story behind the iconic turtleneck, and then we'll work our way down the fit from there. In the early 80s, Steve Jobs visited Sony in Japan and noticed that all the workers across the factories wore the same uniform. He spoke to the then company chairman, Akio Morita, about this, who explained that following World War II, companies like Sony had to provide their workers with clothes due to shortages. Over time, this became a signature style for Sony, creating a sense of identity for employees that bonded them to the company. The uniform included a custom-designed nylon jacket that could convert into a vest via removable sleeves and was designed by none other than Issey Miyake. For the uninitiated, Issey Miyake is undoubtedly one of the goats of fashion and was famous for creating designs that were just as much utilitarian and futuristic as they were elegant and beautiful. He was one of the key figures in the rise of experimental and avant-garde fashion in Japan in the 70s and 80s, and as a result is in part responsible for the reputation that Japan has for fashion in the modern day. He's the only designer I've seen who has been able to make die-hard fashion fans froth at the mouth for 100% polyester clothes, and his label was also responsible for this extremely notorious bomber jacket, which has been worn by the likes of Robin Williams, A$AP Rocky, and Playboi Carti. This jacket is an archive fashion grail for many fashion fans. Izzy's focus on innovation and technology aligns very well with the mindset of Steve Jobs, and the two became friends after Steve gave him a call asking him to design a vest similar to the Sony uniform for Apple. He stated he wanted to try replicate that same company bonding, and so returned from his trip to Japan with some samples and excitedly told his colleagues that they should all start wearing these cool vest uniforms. This went exactly as you would expect, and the people at Apple really were not on board with the idea of a company uniform, which, yeah, makes sense. You wouldn't be able to enforce daily showering with computer programmers, let alone a work uniform. Although it is funny that decades later, the unofficial Silicon Valley programmer uniform would actually include a vest, being the Patagonia gilet. Despite the idea of an Apple employee uniform falling through, Steve and Izzy stayed friends, which instead led to the inception of the most iconic piece from Steve Jobs' own personal uniform. He really liked the black turtlenecks made by Izzy Miyake's label, so Jobs asked if he could make him some more and got sent hundreds of them. As a result, Steve Jobs wore this same item of clothing pretty much every day for the rest of his life. I think it's interesting to look back on Steve Jobs' wardrobe now, especially as the idea of having a personal fashion uniform has been very popular in the past few years. This is likely in response to and in rejection of overconsumption, combined with the rise of performative authenticity. I go more in depth regarding my thoughts on the rise of personal uniforms and capsule wardrobes in a past video, so go watch that if you care, but within online discourse surrounding this subject, Steve Jobs is always brought up and is pretty much the poster child of having a personal uniform. At this point you might be thinking, oh, it's cool and respectable that he was even that committed to one outfit, but in terms of the styling, it's nothing special and even a bit tasteless. So can you really say he was influential to any degree in terms of fashion? Well, funnily enough, this tastelessness of Steve Jobs' look turned out to have far more of an impact than you might think. The next component of the Steve Jobs uniform is Levi 501s, which don't really need much analysis. They're likely the most classic and trend cycle immune pair of jeans, so it's an unsurprising choice from Steve. But where things get interesting is the trouser-shoe interaction. Funnily enough, a combo like this, you know, techie sporty type shoes plus jeans of a looser fit, is somewhat normalized in the modern fashion zeitgeist, but for a long time, something like this was considered very unfashionable and something either a suburban dad or a stereotypical nerd would wear. In 2014, we saw the rise of a style movement called normcore. Essentially, this was just embracing normal shit, dressing in an inoffensive and quite boring way. You know how normal people dress. At the time, this idea of categorizing dressing like a normie into an aesthetic was heavily ridiculed, but it still acted as a rejection of the flashy fashion trend from the 2000s and was really the first whiff of the wave of post-ironic internet culture-driven fashion that would dominate in the decade following. Jerry Seinfeld and Steve Jobs were the two main references for the normcore trend. This is also how the dad shoe trend came about, which again Steve Jobs was referenced a lot for due to his love of chunky New Balance shoes. This trend evolved into the Balenciaga massive shoe hype, which nearly a decade later people are still buying into, and just in general helped make chunky shoes relevant again, and also helped boost the popularity of brands such as New Balance and Asics in mainstream fashion, especially with all the collaborative releases they've done in recent times. It's the way Steve Jobs was unstylish and kind of boring, which is what made him an unsuspecting influence on contemporary fashion and why he was constantly referenced in regards to the normcore and dad shoe trends. Back in the early days of Facebook, around 2006, Mark Zuckerberg's public image was perceived as completely unprofessional compared to other figureheads from the dot-com boom era, and so naturally that came with underdressing for his role. While this made him more relatable during the very short period in his career where he was actually respected and perceived as a cool young innovator, this was the last sign of authenticity we saw from Mark, as he started down a path of over-engineering every aspect of his public image, including his fashion. In 2009, he started wearing a tie and other business casual acceptable clothes, which happened around the time he was trying to make Facebook actually profitable as a business. So I think he was just in his investor bootlicking cosplay, or maybe it was to seem more relatable to the public during the recession. Either way, this was definitely an attempt to appear more grown up, to signal that he was the responsible leader who should be trusted with dealing with the ethical issues that come with commodifying friendship on a global scale. In 2010, Mark was named Time Magazine's Person of the Year, which you might think would be a great achievement, but unfortunately for him, they did him so dirty with this photo. It's so deeply unsettling, creepy, and reptilian. This is where all the lizard jokes started, and yeah, 15 years on, he has still not managed to shake the reptilian reputation.
No, on that. I am not a lizard.
So Mark finds himself in a dilemma. The internet thinks he's either a reptilian straight out of one of those conspiracy theories your uncle who's had too much lead exposure believes in, or some sort of robot due to his inhuman way of walking, sitting, talking, and I guess just everything he does. As this is happening, the public was becoming more and more skeptical of Facebook due to its expanding size and how much influence it had, and so there was a growing sentiment of distrust for Mark. So, what does Mark do to fix his image and convince everyone he's a responsible, trustworthy, and relatable leader who's worthy of leading one of the most influential and powerful companies in the world? He decides he's only going to wear grey t-shirts. In a Q&A in 2014, Mark explains why he chose to commit to this personal uniform. I really want to clear my life, so I have to make as few decisions as possible about anything except how to best serve this community. I'm in this really lucky position where I get to wake up every day and help serve more than 1 billion people. I feel like I'm not doing my job if I spend any of my energy on things that are silly or frivolous about my life. So that way I can dedicate all my energy towards just building the best products and services. It's hilarious how he tried to spin this into some sort of gracious gift to the world by freeing up a little bit more of his mega brain's processing power to further serve the community of over 1 billion people. Yeah, Mark, please optimize your brain to harvest even more of my data. That's definitely going to serve the community. Also, I don't know why he's pretending he was putting any brain power into his outfits before the whole grey t-shirt uniform thing. I'm sure the only critical thinking that went into putting these sorts of outfits together for Mark was deciding whether or not the clothes he found on his bedroom floor passed the BO smell test and were socially acceptable enough to wear into the Facebook office. If it isn't abundantly obvious already, this grey t-shirt uniform era thing was clearly copying Steve Jobs and then trying to justify it with some sort of business bro, life optimization, circle jerk nonsense explanation. This is why Steve Jobs had more swag than Zuckerberg ever could. Mark performed this uniform, making a costume of the public figure he desperately wanted to be viewed as, while Steve just really liked this one turtleneck that his friend Izzy made. I mean, he did prove that he was actually committed to the turtleneck and wore it until he died. Mark, on the other hand, has ditched the grey t-shirts, but we'll get into that in a moment. You might be thinking, oh, but Steve Jobs' turtlenecks were from a designer label and retailed for $270 each, while Mark explicitly explained his grey t-shirts were a rejection of the frivolous and silly nature of fashion. Well, it turns out that each of these grey t-shirts cost at least $300 as they were custom made by Italian luxury label Brunello Cucinelli. That doesn't sound very relatable, down to earth, or a rejection of the frivolous nature of fashion like Mark was going on about in that Q&A. He couldn't just simply wear some consumer level t-shirts like he used to, or maybe some premium but notoriously high quality and long lasting t-shirts like the loop wheeled ones from Mers B. Schwannen. You know, the ones that this guy wore in The Bear that I'm sure you've heard of. At least then there would be some level of justification for utilitarianism, because the quality and durability of these loop wheel t-shirts are what makes them a luxury item, rather than just being something extremely excessive. But of course, Mark still had to make a discreet but clear distinction between himself and the peasants he was trying to cosplay as to appear more relatable and trustworthy. Although I have been absolutely shitting on Mark's fashion choices, I do think the grey t-shirt era ironically presented him in a far more authentic way than you might expect. It's just not in the way he desperately wanted to be perceived as. He wanted to appear relatable, trustworthy, and community focused, but underneath it, he's still a tech billionaire overlord, and so ultimately his main concern is himself. This is already blatantly obvious from the way he acquired companies that threatened Facebook's dominance in the 2010s, all while the platform he originally built had stagnated and only added features copied straight from other rival social media apps. No amount of posturing via performative underdressing can hide that, and I mean the FTC has been trying to sue him for the past 5 years. So there's that if you wanted an even larger hint that Mark is probably only interested in being community focused when he dominates said community, makes an unfathomable amount of wealth from it, and engulfing any other companies that threaten that dominance like a game of Agar.io. If you look into what values Brunello Cucinelli, the designer label responsible for Mark's grey t-shirts, you unlock a whole new level of irony. The first thing you see when you click on their website is the quote, "Beauty is a symbol of the morally good." I mean, if that's what makes something beautiful, then Marky is one ugly fucker. Let's not forget the Cambridge Analytica scandal, and more recently, Mark has let Meta AI access and train itself on a massive database of pirated books and other literature called Library Genesis. That situation alone says it all about his twisted ethics. Everyone knows that pirating is only morally correct when it's done to products from one specific company that rhymes with Shinobi. Brunello Cucinelli has a whole section on their website that describes their brand manifesto of human capitalism and human sustainability, which essentially boils down to making profit not being the ultimate goal of the business and having a focus on ethics and social responsibility. But in recent years, he has finally dropped the act and gone through another personal rebrand, which included another wardrobe revamp. In 2024, he dropped the subtle Brunello Cucinelli t-shirts for blatant and loud luxury items like this Balmain t-shirt he was photographed wearing in Ibiza last year. Hang on, I thought this was a guy who went on about fashion being frivolous and silly, but suddenly in 2024, Mark has become Mr. Put That Shit On. It's almost like this slimy reptilian is a self-serving, opportunistic grifter who will ditch any belief or moral stance as soon as the opposite becomes more beneficial to him. His new look is basically just dressing like a 40-year-old fraternity fuckboy with boxy oversized t-shirts and a gold chain necklace. Also, against everyone's expectations, Mark has actually had a hand in designing the new clothes he's been wearing.
What?
These t-shirts that have massive Greek or Latin phrases on them were made in partnership with American designer Mike Amiri, which again just feels like an attempt to replicate Steve Jobs and Izzy Miyake's friendship. Looking into what some of these Greek and Latin phrases that Mark proudly shows to the world translate to is where things get interesting. At a Meta keynote, he was wearing one of these t-shirts which had the phrase
Aut Zug, aut nil.
a modification of the Latin quote,
Aut Caesar, aut nil.
which translates to either a Caesar or nothing, so basically either Zuck or nothing. Yeah, that's not ominous. He was also spotted wearing a t-shirt at his 40th birthday party in May, which I don't think was from his collaboration with Mike Amiri. Still, he had the Latin quote,
Carthago delenda est.
which means Carthage must be destroyed, which refers to the attitude of the ancient Romans towards their enemies. In a modern context, this basically just means a strong and uncompromising desire to dominate and destroy something. Once again, not fucking ominous at all. Mark has finally dropped the very obvious act he's been failing to keep up for over a decade and is kind of having a fuck what you think, I'll do what I want because I'm rich and being progressive isn't profitable anymore moment, and has finally quit his I'm relatable cosplay. He's finally comfortable embodying his completely unattainable and indulgent lifestyle through his fashion choices instead of presenting a thinly veiled facade of luxury grey t-shirts. Alright, which billionaire's next? Let's kick things off with my favourite Elon quote of all time. I love fashion. He said this to reporters at the Met Gala back in 2022, and most people would probably assume he was attempting some sort of sarcastic, self-aware joke, but to everyone's surprise, he follows up that statement by saying, I do actually, and elaborates with a very earnest explanation. Sometimes it's viewed as frivolous and maybe not that important, but I think beauty is very important, and style and things that move the heart. The thing is, this is quite a sweet and sincere thing to say. It's just kind of funny that the person saying it was Elon while dressed like the fat controller from Thomas the Tank Engine. To be fair to Elon, there does seem to be some truth to his statements, as he has tried to go beyond the tech billionaire fashion stereotype of trying really hard to underdress and has actually utilized clothing to convey himself as a person. An example of this would be his appearance at the South by Southwest conference in 2018, where he wore a vintage leather aviator jacket and engineer boots, which gives off a spaceship pilot vibe, especially as he was talking about space travel and colonizing Mars. This is also why he has been seen wearing cowboy hats and has stated that he is a fan of the space cowboy aesthetic. Around this time in 2018, he was actually being styled by designer Emily Dawn Long for public appearances. She helped him rework his wardrobe to be more in line with the look of masculine style icons such as Harrison Ford, Paul Newman, and Ernest Shackleton. I have no doubt this was Elon's idea, as he clearly views himself as being in the same league as these individuals in terms of image. But unfortunately for Elon, trying to present yourself as a cool, masculine icon doesn't work when you do objectively uncool things such as pretending to be your infant child on Twitter and tweeting shit like this. As a man, one of the easiest improve your fashion and sense of style life hacks you can implement is bagging an artsy alternative girlfriend. Elon did this and still dressed the same after that relationship crashed and burned like a SpaceX rocket. Although, to be fair, not that long ago he did try out a super quirky haircut, but the internet was very quick to label this the low Hitler fade. Elon, if you're watching this, my advice to you is to drop this trying to come across as some sort of macho Hollywood hero. We all know you're a villain, so my advice would be to find a Hollywood villain to emulate instead. Luckily for you, I've done the hard work and gone through all of Hollywood's villains and found the perfect one for you. Why have I picked Gru from Despicable Me, you might ask? Well, Elon does not have the same body type as Harrison Ford or Paul Newman, which is another reason why emulating them never worked for him. But somehow he is built exactly like this animated character. Before we look at the final Tech Billionaires fashion, I'd like you to refer to this image. While you may think this is just a silly meme, it's clear that Jack Dorsey, co-founder and past CEO of Twitter, took it very seriously and has been wearing lots of Rick Owen pieces for quite a while now. Although he hasn't always dressed like this, back in the early days of Twitter, Jack wasn't a fashion enthusiast by any means, but he was still definitely way more put together than nearly all of his Silicon Valley counterparts. Loafers and jeans were a common combination for him, as well as many other business casual looks. Again, nothing special, but at least it was better than jeans and sandals. However, during the mid-2010s, Jack started to go deeper and deeper into the fashion rabbit hole. We saw him hop on the hypebeast bandwagon, and in 2017 he was seen wearing this full Yeezy-coded outfit. But as already mentioned, it was the clothes from Rick Owens that became the central focus of his personal style. As early as 2014, you can see him wearing pieces from the designer like this leather jacket. Then he started wearing different types of Rick Owens footwear, which eventually progressed into him wearing full Rick Owens outfits for both day-to-day life and public appearances. You might think I'm about to start taking the piss out of Jack for this, but unfortunately I do think this look suits him. He's not going for the craziest Rick pieces, but he dresses well for his body type, and I think the style does work for him. This isn't to say I'm a fan of Jack Dorsey or anything, but from a fashion perspective, he did the whole becoming a tech billionaire overlord thing the right way. He created the single most toxic place on the internet, got ricked out head to toe, and then kind of dipped from public attention. While his peers regularly get humiliated and ridiculed on the internet, he's just chilling backstage with Mr. Owens himself after one of his runway shows. I know there are quite a few tech billionaires I've missed out in this video, such as Jeff Bezos, but there's not much to say about him other than he used to be a nerd who dressed like shit, and now he's a roided up nerd who still dresses like shit. And I guess he also exemplifies the issue with the worst dressed tech billionaires, being that they all try way too hard to come across as stereotypically masculine, and the only people it impresses are racist 13-year-olds who make funk edits on TikTok. Jensen Huang, the CEO of Nvidia, also does a whole leather jacket masculine thing, kind of like Elon Musk, but he's responsible for the RTX 3070 that allows me to make and export these YouTube videos, so I've decided I'm going to be less mean to him. I know I've been a bit of a hater for this whole video, but these guys are literally fucking billionaires. You have no excuse to dress like shit when you're breaded like that. I'm sorry, that's just the rules. And for anyone watching this video who is genuinely upset that I took the piss out of their favorite billionaire, then I have no idea why you're watching a YouTube channel that focuses on fashion. Yeah,
you're not one of us, bro.